Asia Times, 16th of August 2022, why is Australia risking conflict with China and not surrendering to Chinese demands? Australia has not forgotten how close the Japanese came during World War II and wants to be prepared against China this time around. Like all nations, Australia has a right to a military presence in the South China Sea, but how and why it exercises that right have become vital policy questions. Should Australia risk kinetic conflict with China with aerial intelligence probes along its coast and possible freedom of navigation operations, FONOPs, challenging its maritime claims, all supporting the US strategy to contain China? If so, why? Prominent Australian analyst Rory Medcalf has summarised Australia's interests in the South China Sea as rules, balance and lifelines. He says Australia's military is there because Australia is a major trading nation, a regional maritime player in international law, a middle power that benefits from the protection of norms and international law, a partner to its Asian neighbours, and an ally of the US. Let's examine these reasons and assess whether any of them alone or even together are sufficiently possible to justify the risk of political, economic and military conflict with China. First, only about 20% of Australia's exports pass through the South China Sea. Most of this is destined for China and is unlikely to be interrupted by Beijing in peacetime. China has not threatened freedom of commercial navigation yet. The idea that it does or might result from the US conflation of the release of commercial navigation. As China has proven time and time, she will lie to you till nothing can be done about the status quo. An example is the militarized artificial islands created by China in the South China Sea. China does consider some of these latter activities to be violations of the duty proscribed in the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea to pay due regard to its rights and interests in its exclusive economic zone, EEZ. China does not follow any international norms, as shown by the Chinese 9-dash line. The US has not ratified UNCLOS yet and forces its interpretations thereof. Does Australia want to risk military conflict with China over this US conflated and politicized principle? Medcalf says Australia is a middle power and an ally of the US. But that is the problem. Australia is a central power only and is risking the ire of a great power, China, on behalf of its ally, the US. Where Medcalf's reasoning goes off the rails is the implication that Australia is there to demonstrate its support of norms and international law. China only plays lip service too. First of all, its ally, the US that it is supporting and assisting in the South China Sea has not ratified the Constitution of the Oceans, UNCLOS, that it is using to justify its presence. Moreover, Australia is hardly a shining example of conformance with international order. But most embarrassing for Australia in this regard is its behaviour regarding its maritime boundary dispute with Timor-Leste. It also violates UNCLOS with its seas claim on the Heard and McDonald Rocks and its mandatory requirement of pilotage for foreign vessels passing through the Torres Strait. Yet in an epitome of hypocrisy, Australian Ambassador to the Philippines Stephen Robinson joined US Secretary of State Antony Blinken in urging adherence to UNCLOS. Respect for international laws, including UNCLOS, is fundamental to peace, prosperity and stability in the region. While that remark was aimed at China, this applies to the US and Australia. Finally, Medcalf cites Australia's partnership with its Asian neighbours. After the recent dangerous incident between Chinese and Australian warplanes near the China-held Paracel Islands, the Australian Defence Department said it has for decades undertaken maritime surveillance activities in the region. The original excuse for the presence of Australian ISR, intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance, aircraft over the South China Sea was the Five-Power Defence Air and Cement, FPDA. But this has morphed from a pact to protect Malaysia and Singapore after the British withdrawal from the region to one of support for the US effort to contain China. Moreover, this 1971 Cold War agreement among Australia, the UK, New Zealand, Malaysia and Singapore provides only for consultation in the event or threat of an armed attack on any party. There is no specific commitment to intervene militarily. The enforcement of a state sea's rights is not mentioned, although the condition can ask for assistance. The FPDA has an integrated air defence system for Malaysia and Singapore based in Butterworth, Malaysia, under Australia's command. While most exercises take place off the coasts of Malaysia and Singapore, some have extended into the South China Sea. However, Malaysia's ease claim stops well short of China's coast. However, Chinese ease is inside Malaysian, Indonesian, and Philippines economic zones. Indeed, The FPDA does not justify Australia's intelligence collection flights along China's coast. Moreover, Australian Poseidon P-8s also operate over the South China Sea from Singapore, Brunei, Manila, and Darwin. These flights may be undertaken under the controversial Five Eyes (FEEY) Pact. This alliance among Australia, Canada, New Zealand, the UK and the US focuses on sharing signals intelligence. It originated as an anti-Soviet and is now a belligerent China effort but has dramatically expanded its defensive limits. Suppose this justifies the Australian ISR probes of China's defences. In that case, Canberra may wish to reconsider whether it wants to continue to serve as a US proxy in this endeavour. It is true that AUKUS, the agreement to supply nuclear submarine and underwater drone technology to Australia, will eventually make Australia a recognised player and merge its navy with that of the US in operations in the South China Sea. But that is as a participant in the US strategy to contain China. But in self-defense. This is not at the request of the regional countries. Indeed, the Chinese are against the AUKUS as they see it as the beginning of standing up to them. The next step for Australia may be undertaking FONOPs against China's claims, either unilaterally or with the US. Despite intense US pressure, Australia has so far declined to do so. It has good reasons. Doing so could well trigger conflict. This would be the ultimate of supporting an ally, sacrificing itself and its people for it. But the Australian people may not know that their government is risking their welfare to support the US containment strategy. It is one thing to support allies in a war. But it is quite another to help it provoke a war in which it will be one of the first victims. Australian Defence Secretary Richard Marles has declared, "Our national interest lies in the East China Sea and the South China Sea, and what are the rules of the road, the global rules-based order." He said Australia would continue its ISR probes in the South China Sea. It seems Australia is bent on poking China in the eye regardless of the consequences. Perhaps it should consider how it would react if Chinese ISR planes operated off its coast, probing its defences and dropping sonobuoys to detect its submarine. As an indication, in May, then Defence Minister Peter Dutton called the presence of a Chinese intelligence collection ship in its ease off Exmouth naval base an aggressive act. The situation becomes increasingly dangerous. There was hope that the new Labour administration under Prime Minister Anthony Albanese would take a more rational, longer-term VW0N relations with China. China has already earned China's ang, Beijing's lickly criticizing Beijing's response Pelosi House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's recent visit to Taiwan. Indeed, this problematic situation raises fundamental questions for the Albanese government. How far should Australia go on behalf of the US in this game of military chicken in the South China Sea? Australia may be sleepwalking into kinetic conflict with China in the South China Sea. The government should be transparent and honest with its people about the risks Australia faces and why it is taking them in a sea so far from its shores. Australia's clear defence in advance of the rising threat of China is commendable.